Hello everyone, my name is Reverend Dr. ALFRED TUMWESIGYE, uh, who is a member of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, an organization that recognizes the need to dialogue from and beyond local culture and interconnect within a world church. This network fosters cross-cultural interdisciplinary conversations about critical issues in theological ethics shaped by shared visions of hope. So I am part of the African region, and I present this webinar, which will be part of a series of webinars that will come your way. And that slide, as you see, is my bio. And today I would like to invite you to journey with me to look at contextual bioethics in Africa. And I'm addressing this topic, which is contextual African bioethics, voices that echo from the sub-Saharan Africa in global bioethics. So we shall follow this outline. We shall look at the definitions, and then we look at the African bioethics landscape, and then we shall look at contextual bioethical issues in Africa and contemporary voices of contextual African bioethics. And then we shall look at models of a new contextual African bioethics. And to that I'm putting two models, and that is one, a new biosocial approach, theological bioethics, and also the population level approach to bioethics from two of our African theologians. And then I will have a conclusion and references that I will have used. Let us dive in and look at the definitions. What is bioethics? Bioethics comes with a series of different studies. Say it's an interdisciplinary field which looks at the ethical issues arising from advances in medicine, in life sciences, in healthcare technologies. It looks or it examines the moral and social and legal implications of topics like, for example, environmental, public health, scientific research. It has also a broad scope, which could include environmental policy, which include also new biological, technological improvements or developments. Now, today we are grappling with artificial intelligence and all that. So, from that definition, it's when we put ourselves and look at the contextual African bioethics in this presentation. And these are the voices that echo from sub-Saharan African region in global bioethics, which refers to a growing field of scholarship that seeks to ground bioethical discourse in the moral philosophies, in the cultural values, in the socio-economic realities of sub-Saharan Africa. So this movement is different from the historical dominance of the Western bioethics, particularly the principalism model, which is often criticized as being too focused on the individual and potentially incompatible with African moral systems. So the contextual bioethics approach to bioethical decision-making recognizes that moral issues are not made in a vacuum, but are deeply influenced by specific circumstances, by specific surroundings, by specific factors, and therefore it requires using non-formal reasoning like observation, like critical assessment, to understand those complex features of a situation, including, as I mentioned, moral philosophies, cultural values, socioeconomic realities, in this case in the sub-Saharan African region. And therefore it calls us to emphasize a case-by-case analysis where solutions are tailored to the unique context, in this case, which would be the sub-Saharan African region. And then we can develop a contextual African bioethical voice in the world, in the global bioethics. Africa is a continent that is comprised of 54 countries. And this has diverse, varied ethical traditions, cultures, diverse healthcare practices, diverse healthcare systems, diverse government leaderships, and all that. And when we talk of contextual African bioethics, we're looking at that landscape. A landscape which is also laden with the multivariate, multi-layered dimensions of African religio-cultural life, contextual features, indigenous traditions, Christian faith and Muslim faith, and all that, as quoted from Jake and Twitter in 2022. Therefore, when we highlight this landscape, we are looking at this sub-Saharan area, which is with all that. So, sub-Saharan African countries pride in an exuberant faith, as I mentioned. Yet, we continue to see a manifest of individuals or cultures or institutions that do not value life or even care for it. What do I mean here? You see a growing complaint of unequal power relations, for example, between Africa and the West, between the global North and the global South. We see it's a region that is susceptible to manipulation and exploitation of bad leadership that attracts international manipulation. This we have seen even in wars, which has brought so much untold suffering on the peoples. We see the lack of observance to fundamental human rights. This is manifested in structural failure with violence that come with it in some of the countries. We see that the distribution of African resources or social goods and services continue to manifest disparities in healthcare, in medical care, in education, and other social services at the people's disposal. Also, this region faces challenges such as climatic shocks and rising temperatures, high level of toxicity, especially when it comes to garbage management and all that. Therefore, when we say what are these voices given this African bioethics landscape, these voices trying to look at human condition of fragility and finitude that are bioethical, social, cultural, economical, environmental, structural, and political. These voices look at the lack of democratic accountability among countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the scourges of corruption, the environmental degradation, and human rights abuses that we continue to see even now and then. We see in this landscape where we need to do contextual African bioethics, the poor or the voiceless need a voice. The local communities where they live need to be heard by new systems in place that would address the challenges of the people, that would bring the basic human interests of these peoples if they had survived and live fruitfully in their environment. Therefore, a closer look at the current bioethics trend in African sub-Sahara will argue that for contextual African bioethics to emerge, we need to question We need to ask ourselves, we need to go beyond bioethical principles and its limitations to non-Western communities, to African societies, to their values, and make a different path, different from the Western world. Many bioethical scholars from sub-Saharan Africa have asked these questions. Is the practice of bioethics in Africa, for example, a colonial agenda or an intended imperialistic project? Is African bioethics entirely a product of the Western programmed goals of training and institution building, or a structural consequence of many receptive African minds and institutions? When we ask ourselves these questions, therefore, as I present in this webinar, we develop a spotlight of voices that will echo from sub-Saharan Africa, together to reimagine the African bioethics and have its rightful position in global bioethics. And to understand that, I would like to look at the intersection of Western bioethics and contextual African bioethics. When you look at this, Western bioethics is a framework primarily built on 4 principles, that is autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, which was developed by figures like Boucherp and Childress and has influenced the global trends in the discussion of bioethical issues. While these principles are applied globally, this approach, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, it has created concerns. It has created concerns because its focus is on an individual, but in sub-Saharan Africa we focus on the community, on the family, and those perspectives sometimes are not well catered for in Western bioethics. Much as this global framework using the 4 principles are used internationally, especially like, for example, in the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, to provide a universal framework for bioethics, it generates tensions when it is out of sync with African values, as I mentioned. And with that, principlism, which is a dominant ethical framework, cannot be copied or pasted in sub-Saharan Africa. That's why we are talking of contextual African bioethics, which is backed by contextual theologies, by integrating indigenous worldviews, traditions, and values, by respecting African cultural worldview, by synchronizing it with African values about family, about community, about leadership of elders, and it should be rooted on ethical values in African traditions and reflective of contextual African cultural values. And when we look at the two, it's not like they are in complete opposite of one another, because I would like to highlight that as I present this, Western principlism also can provide a community-centered alternative. And that should come in through contextual African bioethics, which would enrich the Western principlism and have that voice heard. Therefore, this new framework I am presenting, it should address complex ethical issues. It should promote dialogue rather than one-size-fits-all set of rules. It should provide ethical guidelines for international collaboration and health research, so that as we promote that, then as a continent, as sub-Saharan Africa, would benefit in sharing with that greater community engagement on the global bioethical discourse. Therefore, the voices that echo from sub-Saharan Africa in global bioethics refers to a movement toward developing contextual African bioethics that moves beyond the Western-centric frameworks. Therefore, the application of pragmatic and preferential solidarity that lies in the liberation approach to suffering is very, very important. These voices also carry with them a cultural and religious pluralism, cultural sensitivity, respect and incorporation of African values and perspectives. These voices advocate. They advocate for communal consent. In the Western bioethics, they talk of autonomy. And with that comes in the individual consent. And this Western model of individual autonomous consent, when it comes to Africa, it can be challenged because the African approach often advocates for communal consent, or a process where the community's perspective is factored in, especially for large-scale research projects that have been performed on the continent, whereby the community's perspective is factored in when it comes to policy. When they are writing policies, when African governments are writing policies, the community approach is factored in. Therefore, we can say these voices should really advocate for communal consent. Another beautiful thing is that the voices from African bioethics also promote the good of the population. And here we can talk of the common good. The common good, and which is enshrined in solidarity. What do I mean here? So solidarity here should be promoting not only the common good, but also be privileged to attend to the challenges that people meet, be it environmental, be it healthcare, be it participation in their day-to-day lives, so that they work together and they work together for the common good of the people of the continent. These voices also look at decolonizing bioethics by developing frameworks that are culturally and contextually relevant. Therefore, as we look at the modeling of this new contextual African bioethics in sub-Saharan Africa, it calls for the threading of different voices that will offer a practical moral fiber that is unbreakable and remarkable, which will be the blueprint of an equitable, just, and ethical structure in addressing the social, the health, the economical, and the political spheres of sub-Saharan African peoples. That is, blending African philosophical thought, religiosity, African health perspectives in sub-Saharan Africa with Catholic social teaching, which carries a moral consequence and a moral and social attitude to foster solidarity with preferential option for the poor, working together with openness to science, technology, all at the service of human dignity. Therefore, any attempt to doing bioethics in sub-Saharan Africa must respond to common culture expressed via history, with particular national figures and common ancestors as well as common customs. It should underline community. It should underline solidarity. It should focus on person as part of the community and avoids focusing on individual differences. And this is what we call Ubuntu. And when we talk of Ubuntu as an ethic, as an ethical practice, we are looking at the common traits and characteristics of African people, where there is a deep respect for one another, for ancestors, deep respect for the communalism when they do things together, and as Pope Francis mentioned, we can say the integral ecology. integral ecology, whereby the relationships, the integral ecology is applied to help the human relationships grow with each other and are built on natural environment. To this, working together is very important, and the Ubuntu philosophy, where we say I am because we are because I am, is very, very important, because it encapsulates this idea whereby it emphasizes that a person's identity and morality are deeply tied to their communal relationships. And not only communal relationships, as Pope Francis said, also to their ecological relationships with nature, with the environment, and all that is factored in. Therefore, that is a very important point that we need to underline the value of community, of solidarity, of the philosophy of Ubuntu. It should also envelop the key values that is solidarity, compassion, respect, human dignity, conformity to basic norms and collective unity, which is fundamental in denoting humanity and human dignity as a whole, if we are to build moral principles. It should be backed by contextual theologies, enculturation, think of that, African values and ethics. It should be respectful of African cultural worldview and uncover, examine, and censor how the intersection of those overbearing values from the West continue to have malicious effects on the well-being of the peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. So it should advocate and foresee that if there is exploitation, then that has to be addressed. It should shape and influence the public health cry and other bioregulation needs to promote better health, be it public health, life and care of the African peoples in every institution. So, African voices in global bioethics call for a pragmatic paradigm shift that define the African voice in a global bioethics whose contextual features are imbued with both cultural and gospel values, with ethical norms, with Catholic social teaching. And when I say Catholic social teaching, it should really be well reasoned and addressed, so that the individual, the family, the institutions, and society, they all embody those values that bring justice and preferential option for the poor. And it should really be according to African mindset. Again, the concept of personhood, Ubuntu, and the dignity of human person as it is enshrined in African communalism. As I said, two African great scholars, Professor Stanchu Iro and Jacquino Azetop, God bless his memory, provide us with two perspectives which I think are very, very important. One is the new biosocial approach. Under this, we can also talk of theological bioethics, where, as Professor Stanchu Iro says, Jesus walks the path with and makes his tent with African peoples through sacrifice and pain and sometimes through death. So people hold on to Christ and follow his path as shown by the church. And again, this is through Catholic social teaching and the African theology, where justice and peace are overcome, being played to many Western powers, that the forces of globalization, the ecological and natural disasters that have really robbed African peoples of abundant life in Christ. So we need to look at that. Also, he talks of theological enterprise that engage the liturgical, the cultural, the socio-economic, the moral universe of African Christians or African Christianity. So all that is a new biosocial approach that if we are to do contemporary contextual African bioethics, we cannot do away with theological bioethics. We cannot do away with the Catholic ethics that have really shaped the growth of bioethical discourse in the world. Professor Azesop also left us with a new approach, which is I call a population level approach to bioethics, whereby he talks of an eco-social and religious understanding of human existence as inspirational framework for contextual bioethics in Africa. He also talks of bioethics that transcends the focus on disease management and clinical work to take a fresh look on the structural marginalization of the masses of the poor, on the health promotion and advocacy, on influence or policy and practices in the broader context of population health. To him, we need to address the political reforms through advocacy, through health policy, through processes and procedures. He also talks of contextual bioethics in Africa must not be limited by disciplinary boundaries emerging from biotechnologies and health sciences, but also embrace the normative and empirical considerations of moral issues and controversies deriving from the African continent. A bioethics shaped by dynamic understanding of local culture and informed by structural and institutional problems that impact the public health as well as a salient contribution of social sciences and social epidemiology can create a lasting impact on the African local communities. And he also says that Catholic social teaching should not be left behind because that's the voice of conscience, to which we can address the pains of those suffering, as Professor Stanichero mentioned in the biosocial approach. So those two voices strike a similarity, but also give us a new perspective on how we can be addressing ethical, moral issues according to the African context if we are to do bioethics in Africa. I would like to conclude that the vision of hope to cultivating contextual bioethics in Africa that is dynamic, that is informative, that is formative and transformative must not only focus on social justice and the allocation of healthcare resources, but also on giving voice to the poor, the voiceless, and to the communities in which they live. It should promote human virtues, it should promote social justice, it should promote integral ecological development, as Pope Francis mentioned in Laudato Si, within the sub-Saharan Africa. And it should question the socio-political processes and institutional values that continue to shape public policy making. It should address the increasing poverty, the political oppression, the social exclusion that shape people's daily experiences in most of these countries. Lastly, the challenges still remain for contextual bioethics in Africa to acknowledge the effects of structural violence, to reckon with social epidemiology in particular, and public health research in general, to locate clinical and research ethics within a framework that considers the social determinants of health, including the social sciences, and stressing the political dimension of bioethics by emphasizing equity-driven policies. So that's an area that needs to be developed as we continue to address those challenges. I want to say thank you for following up with this webinar. It's the first of its kind. And here are some references. If you want to read further, you can look at some of those publications. I think they provide a great deal of how we can grow and develop contextual African bioethics in sub-Saharan Africa so that we can have a strong voice that can speak especially for the poorest of the poor on the continent. So the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So I would like to rest my case. Let me quit talking and invite each one of us that we can begin doing so that we become the voice of contextual African bioethics that are is emerging from sub-Saharan Africa. Have a great time. Looking forward to see you in the next series of webinars. Bye.